Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'd like to share a few stories with you about the mountains and about hunting and fishing, and maybe a couple little short stories and then maybe a long story. But they call me the mountain man. My friends and enemies as well call me that. I live it, breathe it, eat it, and sleep it, and that's what I prefer to be called by, the mountain man. But I'd like to share a little bit about growing up in the mountains and about hunting and fishing in the mountains. And hunting was a way of life. It wasn't a sport. It wasn't something you done for the fun of it and the glory of it and trophies on the wall. It was putting meat on the table. And as far as season is what you put on the meat when you got it to the table. That's what the seasons were. And hunting being a way of life, a lot of tall tales grew about it, and people wanted to outdo each other, and they wanted to be the best hunter, the best fisherman, the best trapper, and the best of everything. And sometimes it got out of hand a little bit, but most of it was good-natured stories, and a couple of them I'd like to share with you. And my grandpa, Roy Green, was one of the best hunters up there. And his favorite thing was squirrel hunting. He fed a family of, I think there was 15 kids in his family, and when he went hunting, he went to kill enough to put meat on the table for a meal for everybody. But he was particular about how he lived and what he did. He tried to live clean, tried to live good. He was an old Free Will Baptist preacher. But one story he told me about, back then there was a lot of turkeys in the mountains. That was before they become hunted out, and then we've restocked them now, and there's plenty of turkeys again in the mountains now. But back then, there was a lot of them. That was in the early 40s. And back then, majority of the people, and especially the older people that had stayed on the farms and lived and still etched out of living in the mountains, hunted with an old gun that had been handed down through the family, an old muzzle-loading gun, just like this old thing here. And you had one shot, and you had to make that shot count. But Grandpa come in one day. He come down off the mountain. He was dragging turkeys. He had them tied all over him. It beat anything I'd ever seen. And his old gun was a mess. I said, Grandpa, I said, how in the world you get all them turkeys with one shot before they all flew off? He said, well, boy, said, you see that haystack up yonder on the mountain? I looked up there and I said, yeah, I know where that haystack is. Most people today don't know what a haystack is. Back in them days, you put a pole up in the middle of the field and you stacked the hay around it, up like that right there, and it weathered just as good as being baled or put in the barn. But he said, well, I'd hunted all morning and didn't see anything. He said, I come out of the woods at the edge of that field up there, and he said all these turkeys was eating around that haystack, eating seeds around the haystack. And he said, I slid back in the woods, and I thought a little bit. Now, I know I could kill one of them, shoot him in the head. I'm a good shot. And said, I might could get two of them. He said, but I need to kill every one of them. He said, and I looked at that old big long gun of mine, and he said, I thought, now the blacksmith down there at Dillsboro, he built this old gun for me, and he said, if I make a mess out of it, said, he can fix it. He said, there was two white oaks there about that big and about that far apart. He said, I just put that old gun between them two white oaks, and he said, I give it all I had. Now, back in them days, them guns was hand forged out of raw iron, and they wasn't carbon steel like we got today, stainless and all that stuff, and you could bend one in a heartbeat. He bent that thing in about a half curve, that barrel. He said, I slid back out there in the edge of the woods. He said, I got out there where I could get a good bead on them. And he said, I pulled down on them turkeys. I took a good fine bead that time. And he said, when that old gun went off, that bullet went around that haystack and killed every one of them. Every one of them. He said, I run out there with my hat and caught it. Said it was still going around the haystack. And he said, that's how I killed every one of them. Now I got to take my gun down there to the blacksmith and get him to straighten that barrel back out. Well, one other time, he was down in a gully. We call it, Nowadays you call it a ravine, but we called it a gully. He was down in a steep gully. Wasn't no way you could walk up the banks. You had to go out the upper end or the lower end. What he was looking for, a rabbit sitting bedded down up under the bank of that gully, and he'd just shoot him in the nose and have dinner for a couple anyhow. Well, he looked up the gully, and yonder come the meanest, wildest, baddest bull you ever seen, stomping the ground and snorting, blowing steam out his nostrils. And Grandpa turned around, gonna stomp Grandpa is what it was. There's a lot of bulls wild in the mountains in them days because the cattle just run loose. Grandpa turned around, gonna run back that way, and here come a big old bear up that way. Well, being an old Baptist preacher and believing in the Lord, he said, jumped out on one knee right there, and he said, Lord, if you can just take care of that bear, I can shoot the bull. Now, if you ain't rolled your britches legs up yet, roll them up a notch or two, because I'm fixing to shoot the bull. There was an old man lived on the bank of the Tuckasegee River up there, and everybody knowed him as Old Man Hawkins. He lived in a little old cabin, and he had a little old field down below his house that he'd cleared and grubbed out the saplings and stuff out. He grew corn and potatoes. That's about what everybody grew, what they could put some away for the winter. And the river was right down below his garden there, below his little old patch. Well, he bragged all the time. Every time a bunch of men got to telling stories about hunting, or they got a big old buck, or they got a turkey, he done more than anybody ever done. He caught more fish than everybody caught. He was better at all of it than anybody ever dreamed of being. Well, they got tired of it. But nobody had ever seen him do anything. And the real cold hard truth is, he never killed nothing. He never shot a gun in his life. Never caught a fish. But he'd lived there 4 or 5 years, and they didn't know where he come from, and they all figured maybe he'd done that somewhere else where he come from. So they got together and they thought up a story to make him put up or shut up or prove what kind of hunter he was. So they said, what we're going to do, we're going to go around the settlement here, and we're going to borrow a gun from somebody that he don't know nothing about. Now the thing about that is, them old guns had fixed sights. There wasn't no adjustable sights, there wasn't no scopes, there wasn't no peep sights. They was fixed. The front and rear, there wasn't no adjustments on them. And the man that built it would put that sight in the middle of the barrel so it'd look right. But you had to shoot that thing a couple times, sometimes more, to figure out which way it shot, left or right, high or low. And then you could be a crack shot with it. But if you never had shot it before the first time, you ain't gonna hit nothing, most likely. But so they went around trying to borrow a gun. Nobody wouldn't let them borrow a gun. Well, they happened to come back down by the old blacksmith there at Dillsboro. Told him what they was wanting. He said, well, fellers, I'll tell you what. He said, I just built an old gun. He said, I built it out of a piece of pipe. He said, it's got about a 3/4 bore. That's that big right there. He said, I'm afraid to shoot it. I'd like to find somebody that would test fire it for me. I got 3 lead balls that I hammered out on the anvil. I got a powder horn full of powder. I got a box of caps. He said, now you take it and let him try it. If he's all the man he says he was and the great hunter that he says he is, he can test fire my old gun for me. So, well, here we go. Now that old gun, like I said, was a cap and ball. This one out here that I've got is a flintlock. But the flintlock was before the cap and ball. But they took off over to Old Man Hawkins' house. There early next morning, there he sat on the porch drinking a cup of coffee. They said, Old Man Hawkins, now you tell us all these tales about what you've done and where you've been and all this stuff. He said, one of them said, you gonna put up or shut up? Said, we got an old gun here that needs trying out and ain't never been fired before, and you're just the man to test that thing. We got 3 bullets, a powder horn full of powder, and a box of caps. Now you got all day to bring something back. He said, well, boys, he was quick-witted. He wasn't going to be outsmarted. He said, Y'all load that thing up the first time. He said, while I go inside and get my hunting coat. Well, he went inside and got his old bum jacket off the nail there hanging there, and he looked out through the crack and he saw him pour powder down the barrel and set a ball on it and pack it down in there and put a cap on it and let the hammer down on it. So he'd come back out with his old hunting jacket, and he threw that powder horn over his shoulder and 2 balls in his pocket and a box of caps. Down through yonder he went. Well, he got to the river down there, and he's figuring on going up on the mountain. Well, there's a little old John boat stays down there on the river. And he got in that old John boat. A John boat, you poled it most of the time. You didn't paddle it. He poled that thing across the river and pulled it up on the bank on the other side, and he went up the mountain. He got up way up on the ridge up there, and he sat down on a stump up there, and he was swatting mosquitoes and flies at him, and as he was sitting up there, and he was sitting up there, and he said to himself, he said, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, I've lied, I have told all them lies, and I ain't never shot a gun in my life. And he said, they'll tar and feather me if I don't get something. Well, he heard something rustling coming down the ridge, and he looked up yonder, and there come a big old buck, a big old 10-point buck. And he just cocked the hammer and throwed it up and shot, and there wasn't enough powder in that thing to get the ball halfway to the big old buck, and it just hit the ground, rolled out through there. And he said, well, I watched him. I'll put a double charge in this thing the next time. So he put a double charge in it and seated another ball on it. He's sitting there a while, still about to decide he's about going to have to go home and face the trouble. Well, that old buck run down the hill from the direction he had come down towards the river down there. He sat there a little while longer, and he heard something else coming down through the woods, and there come a big old bear waddling down through there. He throwed it up, and that time it kaboom, and the ball got to the bear and just threw dirt in his face, but it still wasn't enough powder in there. He said, well, I don't need this powder. He poured the whole powder horn full. The whole powder horn. Seated a ball on top of it. That ramrod stood up about that high. He had that much powder in that barrel. Well, he sat there a while thinking. He said, about an hour. He said, that old bear run down the same way that deer run. And he said, I guess they gone. Well, he got to think. He said, I guess I just might as well go back and face the music. And maybe they won't tar and feather me if I begged their mercy and begged their forgiveness, and maybe they'll let me stay here. So he went down the mountain. He got back down there to the river. Somebody had come along and took that boat back across the river. Well, he's dreading to wade that cold water, and he heard a turkey gobbling. He looked over there, and there's one big old dead oak tree right at the edge of his little field. The tops broke out of it and got one long limb run out, and there's 10 gobblers sitting on that limb just gobbling their heads off. And he done forgot about what a load he put in that thing, but he said, you know what? I bet you I can kill one of them turkeys with this last shot I got. And that'll be all if I can just kill one of them turkeys. Well, son, he cocked that hammer back, and he took a bead that time. When he turned that thing loose and that hammer fell on that cap, it was like 2 sticks of dynamite went off. It split that barrel right down the middle, split it wide open, busted the stock off of it. Half of the barrel went up the river like a bush axe, and the other half went down the river. You can imagine just tearing everything down in sight. It kicked him back up the hill about 10 or 15 feet, and when he come to his senses, his beard was singed, his eyelashes burnt off, his old coat was on fire, and he beat it all out and got his eyes to where he could see again, and there was something wiggling under him. And he got up, and doggone, there had been a groundhog sitting there at the mouth of its hole, And that old gun kicked him back up the hill so hard and so fast, he killed that groundhog when he fell on it and just killed it. He picked that old groundhog up and he said, well, I got something to show for that shot anyhow. He walked back down there to the edge of the river. And now he knows he's going to wade that river. But he heard a thrashing coming down the river. He looked up yonder, and yonder come 11 Canadian geese, belly up, with their heads cut clean off. They was on a little eddy up there, and when that half of that barrel went up through there like a bush axe, like a sword with no handle on it, it cut every one of them's head off. Just boom. Here they come. He got him a big long limb and drug them things out, and he had 10 geese laying on the bank there. Whoo-hoo! Well, he said, I got to get them across the river. He went down the river a little ways, and there's been a big old patch of river cane down there. And that other half of that barrel, it split and went down through there like a bush axe. Had cut down a bunch of that river cane. He got him an armload of it and pulled it back up there and laid it out flat. Got him some honeysuckles and tied it together and broke the tops out of it. Laid them 10 geese on it and that groundhog. Now I got me a raft. That's what I do. I got me a raft, and I'm just going to push it across the river. Well, he started across the river. He went plumb up to his chin, almost just about to go over his head, but he come back out on the bank on the other side over there. And them old bib overhauls like I got on here was pooched out so tight with water. They was tight as a banjo head, tight as a drum head. They was so tight, the top 2 buttons right there popped off like a rifle bullet. Pow, pow! One of them killed a rabbit sitting in the bed over there, and the other one killed a grouse sitting under a bush over there. Just flew off so hard, just like a 22 bullet. Well, when his overhauls fell down, there was 7 rainbow trout fell out of his overalls that he had seined up when he crossed that river. 7 was his limit, by the way, and he never was one to get over his limit of anything. Well, he got them old overhauls back up and cut a piece of shoestring and tied them back up with old groundhog hide shoelaces. Well, there sat that old boat. He put him some water in there, a little bit of water, put them rainbow trout in there. He put them 10 geese in there, put that groundhog in there, and that rabbit, and that grouse, and he stirred around there, and he heard them turkeys again. He ain't paid them no attention since all that happened. He looked up at that big old tree and that limb that went out there like that, and they were still sitting on that limb. He figured, how can that happen with all this commotion? He walked over under the tree and looked up there, and that big old round lead ball had split that limb and slapped back shut and caught every one of them by the foot, and they couldn't go nowhere. They was trapped right there, caught by the feet. He said, I'll just get me an axe. I'll go chop that tree down and chop that limb off and take the whole thing home. So he went about halfway to the house, and there was a double-bitted axe sticking in a stump there. He come back and he started chopping on that tree. As soon as he started chopping on it, he could tell it was hollow, because it was booming, making a booming sound. But when he got into that hollow place, honey started just gushing out of it, just pouring out of it. And there wasn't no bees in there, because the bees had all left, varroa mites or tracheal mites, or queen had died or something, but they was all gone. Today we're having that problem all the time with bees, and we don't know what happened to them, but honey started just gushing out. Well, he started chopping that much harder. Right before the tree started to fall, he heard the awfulest growl he ever heard in his life. Up at the top, that big old broke out top, that old bear he had missed up on the mountain up there had went down in that holler tree after that honey, and just before the tree fell, that old bear jumped out the top of that tree and landed on his head and broke his neck, killed him graveyard dead. Well, the tree fell with a crash. Wow. He walked out there where it fell in some broom straw out there, and there's something sticking up out there that didn't look just right. And he walked out there, and sure enough, that big old 10-point buck that he had missed on the mountain up there right before the bear had bedded down out there. When he chopped that tree, it fell down on him and killed that big old buck. He said, whoo-hoo-hoo, what have I done here? Sure enough. So He got about 50 or 60 pounds of honey out of that thing, all the comb that he could reach up in there and get, and he put that in the boat. Well, he skinned that old buck, skinned that bear, quartered the meat, and put it in the boat. Now in that boat, he's got him a sled now. People use a sled more in the mountains than they did wagons anyhow. So basically he's got a sled, but he's got to get it to the house. He chopped that limb off with them 10 gobblers sitting on it, and stuck it under the front seat, stuck it out the front like that, like one of them old Viking ships, and just left them gobblers sitting on it right there. Now in there he had all that honey, he had all that meat from that buck and that bear meat. He had them 7 rainbow trout, the 10 geese, the grouse and the rabbit and the groundhog. He had all in the boat ready to go, but he said, now I got to get this thing to the house. He looked at them hides there laying there that he had just skinned, that bear and that deer. He remembered his granddaddy telling him way back a long time ago out in the west when he was fighting Indians out there, them Apaches would catch white people and they'd stake them out in the hot sun with rawhide, fresh rawhide, wet. And when that rawhide dried, he'd pull them apart. And horror stories. He remembered his granddaddy telling him about that. So he had this idea. He trimmed that, laid the hides out good and flat. He trimmed the legs off, trimmed them where they was fairly even. Well, he started cutting him a strip around the outside, about 1.5 inches, 2 inches wide, all the way around till he got to the middle. We had a piece about 30, 40 feet long. He done both hides like that. He tied one to the end of the boat, and he tied the 2 together in a good hard knot. And he started to the house, and he's going out that trail right there, and he seen a big old rattlesnake laying out there that didn't look right. Something didn't look right about that rattlesnake. It was straight as an arrow. He went out there, and doggone, sticking out of that rattlesnake's mouth was that ramrod out of that old gun. He had forgotten left a ramrod in it. And that thing went out through there and went down that snake's throat and stretched it out straight as an arrow. He picked it up and said, I'll make me a walking stick out of this. I'll take it home, let it dry, and I'll have me a good, pretty walking stick. So he put that end of that piece of rawhide over his shoulder and started to the house. Well, when he got up to his old cabin, before he got there, he had to stretch with everything he had. He stretched that rawhide till it wasn't much bigger than a rope. And he went right on past the house and tied it around a big oak tree. And he got up and sat down on the porch. Well, word got out. After a while, they come in to see what old man Hawkins got. So, sure enough, said, here they come. Old man Hawkins, where's your game? What'd you get? Did you get anything? He said, well, boys, I'll tell you what. He said, just sit down there, pull you up a stump, or just sit down on a log or a rock. Said, you might have to wait a little bit, but said, it'll be along in a little bit. Well, they don't know what to think, and they see that piece of rawhide going down through the field down yonder to the edge of the river. Well, the sun come up over the mountain then. He lived kind of on the north side. The sun didn't hit till about lunchtime or after. And when it started drying that rawhide, it started stretching, started tightening up, and that old boat started moving. It was slow at first, but the hotter the sun got, the faster it moved. It was just going on like a sled. And them old turkeys, they done all settled down on that limb. But coming through that new ground where all them stumps had been left, that thing was picking up a little bit of speed. The sun was getting hot and dry, and it was picking up a little bit of speed. That boat would hit one of them stumps, and it'd startle all them turkeys, and they'd flap their wings, and they'd jump right over that stump. Come on, here it comes. In a little bit, it comes sliding up in the yard. And they was dumbfounded. They didn't know what to say. They was flabbergasted. They was outdone. Finally, one of them said, old man Hawkins, all I can say is this sure is your lucky day. He reared back like he knew what he was talking about, and he said, well, boys, let me tell you something. I done pretty good, he said, but I could have done a whole lot better. But it took me the first 2 shots with that old rifle to get used to the sights on it. And them old boys, they never doubted old man Hawkins no more. I'd see him go by there and see him sitting on the porch, and he'd be just a grinning away, drinking a cup of coffee. If he said he was going hunting, he was going hunting. If he said he killed a bear, he killed a bear. Whatever he said he done, from then on, nobody ever doubted him anymore. And old man Hawkins, he'll go down in history as the greatest hunter in them Smoky Mountains ever was. Thank you.